1966, the war in Vietnam had swallowed the Annamite Mountains, where the 2nd Marine Regiment was sent to hold the line. Quang Nam was not a battlefield in the ordinary sense. It was a living labyrinth of ridges, rivers, and shadows that resisted every attempt at control. Heat clung to the body like a burden, and the ground itself seemed alive, damp, restless, and unyielding beneath their boots. The Marines began to speak of the jungle as if it were not just terrain, but a presence, indifferent at times, then suddenly hostile without warning. Maps blurred into irrelevance, radios faltered in the thick canopy, and even the compass appeared uncertain, as though the forest bent its own rules. Veterans would later recall that the most dangerous hours were not marked by firefights or ambushes, but by the waiting. Those long stretches when no birds called, no insects stirred, and silence pressed harder than any gunfire. In that silence, the war no longer felt like a campaign, but a descent into something older, something beyond the reach of men. The official records remain precise, clinical, almost hollow. But those who stood there remembered one truth above all: the forest was watching, and it would not remain still forever. They came ashore under a punishing sun, packs heavy with rifles, rations, and the invisible weight of uncertainty. The trail that carried them inland narrowed quickly, forcing the Marines into single file, their boots sinking into mud that seemed to grasp and hold. The air was alive with the constant hum of insects, a droning chorus that never ceased, gnawing at nerves already frayed. Sweat blurred their vision, mixed with dust and salt, and every breath tasted of rot and soil. The jungle gave them no horizon, only walls of green pressing closer with each mile. Branches snapped without warning, sometimes under their own boots, sometimes deeper in the brush, a reminder that movement was never theirs alone. Conversations dwindled into silence, broken only by the labored rhythm of breath and the steady thud of boots against a path that refused to end. Some men clenched their jaws, others muttered prayers under their breath, as though each step carried them further away from the war they knew and deeper into something nameless. By dusk, when they finally halted, exhaustion was absolute, yet no one truly rested. Darkness came fast, and with it a silence so complete it rang louder than gunfire. They believed they had entered the jungle that day. But by nightfall, it felt as though the jungle had entered them. The first reports did not speak of gunfire, nor of enemies hidden in the brush. They spoke of sounds. At dusk, when the jungle usually erupted with insects and frogs, the Marines began to hear something different, a cry that did not belong. It was guttural, deep, almost human, but stretched into a resonance that made it impossible to place. Some swore it echoed between ridges like a signal, repeating in intervals too deliberate to be random. The men froze in formation, eyes searching the tree line, rifles raised toward a darkness that refused to answer. Nothing moved. The jungle, moments before alive, seemed to pause, as though listening to itself. Then the cry came again, closer, sharper, breaking the rhythm of the night. In that moment, the forest was no longer neutral ground. It was a voice, and it was calling back. At first, officers dismissed the reports as nerves, fatigue, or the cries of gibbons, animals common in Vietnam's highlands. But the men who stood in those patrols remembered differently. They remembered the way the sound seemed to press into their bodies, reverberating in the chest more than in the ears. They remembered the silence that followed, a silence too heavy, too staged, as if waiting for a response. Some Marines swore they felt the sound move around them, circling in patterns too complex for an animal call. Others muttered that it was a warning, a boundary line marked by something unseen. Whatever it was, no man slept that night. The jungle had spoken, but no one could agree on what it had said. The first projectile came suddenly, a sharp crack against a helmet that knocked a Marine to his knees. The men spun toward the tree line, rifles ready, but saw nothing. Then more stones came, heavy, jagged, hurled with force that could only be human. They struck the dirt, the trees, the gear stacked near the fire, shattering the illusion of safety. Some Marines shouted for cover, others opened fire into the dark, but their bullets tore only foliage. The stones kept coming in bursts, then stopped as suddenly as they had begun. The patrol regrouped, shaken, unsure whether they had been attacked by Viet Cong or by something else entirely. For the first time, the war had thrown a weapon at them that left no enemy behind. Later, the men inspected the ground. They found rocks too large to be carried by animals, their edges sharp from the nearby hills. What troubled them most was not the weight of the stones, but the direction. They had come from angles opposite to where the enemy was expected. "It was coordinated," one Marine later whispered, though no one dared put it in writing. The official record would mark it as harassment fire, another phantom skirmish in a war already full of them. But the Marines knew what they had felt. Intention. Not random, not blind, but deliberate. Someone or something had reached into their circle of light and tested their fear. And though the stones had ceased, the message remained. The jungle could strike without showing its hand. It was on the third night that the first sighting occurred. A group of Marines, hunched low around the dim fire, caught movement just beyond the glow. It was not the crawl of a Viet Cong scout, nor the quick dart of an animal. The shapes were far too large, towering forms that shifted with a weight and height unfamiliar in that terrain. Their outlines were blurred by distance and shadow, but broad shoulders and elongated frames betrayed something more than human scale. They lingered only long enough to be noticed, and then doubted almost at once. One Marine swore he saw a pair of eyes flash in the firelight before vanishing. Another gripped his rifle until the metal imprinted on his palms. The figures were gone as swiftly as they appeared. But the absence they left behind was heavier than the silence of the jungle itself. Afterward, few dared to speak of it aloud. To name what they had seen was to grant it permanence, and permanence was more terrifying than doubt. The younger Marines tried nervous humor, whispering about forest ghosts, but their voices carried no trace of laughter. The older ones remained silent, their gazes fixed on the dark tree line, as though daring it to move again. The fire sank low, its light shrinking into fragile embers, and fatigue pressed down on every man. Yet no one slept. Each carried the image alone, unsure if it was a trick of weary eyes, or confirmation of something waiting just beyond reach. That night, the forest did not simply surround their camp. It revealed what lived at its edges, and sometimes a glimpse is all it takes to change the war. That night, after the silhouettes dissolved into the tree line, the camp remained frozen in uneasy silence. The fire burned low, and exhaustion pressed on every man, yet no one dared to close his eyes. Then came the sounds, branches snapping, heavy steps circling just beyond the reach of light. No order was given. The first shot rang out as instinct, and within seconds the jungle erupted under a storm of gunfire. Tracers carved fleeting corridors of light between the trees, exposing trunks, vines, and the impression of something moving within them. Many swore they heard the impact of rounds, followed by noises that resembled pain, guttural, heavy, inhuman. But no target revealed itself. The night only gave their fire back in broken echoes, as if mocking them. At dawn, patrols advanced into the zone they had saturated with bullets. The ground was torn apart, trees splintered, and deep impressions marked the mud. Wide tracks stretched forward, larger than a man's, accompanied by dark stains on leaves and roots. Blood, some insisted. Sap, others countered. The trail continued for a short distance, then vanished without explanation, erased as if the forest itself had decided to close behind it. No bodies, no weapons, no proof of an enemy. Just fragments that refused to fit into any report. The official record reduced the night to hostile fire without contact. But for those who had pulled the trigger, the truth was more unsettling. Something had been hit, and whatever it was, it had walked away. As the Marines pushed deeper into Quang Nam, they heard more than rumors of Viet Cong movements. They heard stories. Villagers spoke in hushed voices about the Người Rừng, the forest people. To them, these were not animals or soldiers, but ancient spirits who guarded the mountains and punished those who disrespected the land. Elders pointed to valleys no one crossed, ridges avoided even during harvest season. For the locals, the war between men was just another layer on a territory already inhabited by unseen forces. The Marines, trained to think in terms of maps and firepower, dismissed these tales as superstition. Yet even the most skeptical noticed how villagers lowered their gaze when the Người Rừng were mentioned, as if saying the name too loudly might provoke them. Among the Americans, another name emerged: Rock Apes. It was a nervous nickname, born from the stones hurled out of the dark. For some, it was a bitter joke, a way to reduce fear into mockery. For others, it was simply a label for what they could not otherwise explain. Official reports mentioned neither term. No Người Rừng, no Rock Apes. But in the camps, whispered over cigarettes and firelight, both names circulated. Spirits to the Vietnamese, Rock Apes to the Marines. Two explanations for the same enigma. Their declared enemy wore uniforms and carried rifles. But there was something else out there, nameless, flagless, older than the war itself. The longer the patrols continued, the more the stories began to divide the men. Some Marines clung to the rational explanation. The Viet Cong were using the jungle itself as a weapon, throwing stones, mimicking cries, and playing on nerves already worn thin. Others dismissed that theory, pointing to the size of the silhouettes, the force of the rocks, the marks left in the mud, things no guerrilla trick could fully explain. A few went further still, whispering that maybe the villagers were right. Maybe the Người Rừng, or Rock Apes as they called them, were more than legend. Around the campfires, laughter faded, replaced by silence and glances into the darkness. Doubt was no longer about the enemy. It was about reality itself. The tension spread through the unit like a slow infection. Sleep grew scarce, paranoia heavier. Men began to flinch at shadows, hesitate before entering thickets, or snap at comrades who questioned what they had seen. Trust, the lifeblood of soldiers in war, started to fracture. Were they fighting men, beasts, or spirits? Each answer created its own kind of fear. To call them Rock Apes made them seem like animals, mockable, beatable. To call them Người Rừng made them untouchable, something beyond bullets. Between disbelief and superstition, the Marines carried a new enemy inside themselves, the quiet certainty that no explanation would save them. And in the war's deadliest silence, that certainty was more dangerous than any rifle. The detachment was moving through a narrow valley when the ambush began. From the ridgeline above, the Viet Cong opened fire with light machine guns and rifles, their tracers cutting downward into the clearing. Grenades exploded along the trail, forcing the Marines to dive into the mud for cover. They fired back in controlled bursts, but the enemy had the high ground, their positions well concealed among rocks and foliage. The firefight thundered through the valley, smoke mixing with the drifting mist that hung low over the jungle floor. It was a classic ambush, designed to pin them down and bleed them out. But then, from the opposite side of the valley, came something entirely different. Not gunfire. Stones. The first crashed against a tree, sending shards of bark into the air. Another struck close to a pack, heavy enough to leave a crater in the wet earth. Then more came, hurled with terrifying force, slamming into the ground and ricocheting off trunks with a violence no animal could muster. The Marines found themselves trapped between two fronts, disciplined enemy fire above and a barrage of stones from the unseen darkness behind. Shouts filled the chaos as men tried to split their fire, some aiming up the ridgeline, others pouring bullets blindly into the tree line opposite. No figures revealed themselves, only the sound of impacts and the suggestion of massive movement in the brush. In that moment, the Marines realized the truth of the valley. They were not fighting one enemy. They were caught in the jaws of two. The firefight dragged on for hours, the Marines pinned down between the Viet Cong and the unseen barrage from the opposite slope. Ammunition ran low, tempers frayed, and exhaustion pressed heavier than the weight of their packs. At last, as darkness deepened, the gunfire from the ridgeline faded. The enemy seemed to melt back into the jungle, leaving only smoke, broken branches, and the ringing in their ears. Silence settled over the valley, broken only by the dripping of rain through the canopy. It was in that silence that the roll was taken, and 2 names went unanswered. 2 Marines were missing. No one had seen them fall. No one had seen them taken. They had simply vanished, swallowed by the battle, or by something else entirely. The men began to search, calling their names into the blackness, but the jungle gave no reply. Then came the sound that froze them all, a low rumble from the slopes above. At first they thought it was thunder, but it grew, multiplied, until stones began to tumble down the hillside. Not hurled this time, rolling, as if pushed by unseen hands. Boulders and smaller rocks crashed through the undergrowth, sliding in unnatural rhythm toward their position. It was not an ambush, nor a trap they could explain. It was as if the mountain itself had shifted against them. With 2 men gone and the ground moving under their feet, the Marines faced the unshakable truth. They were no longer fighting the war they had been sent for. They were fighting to survive the jungle itself. With 2 Marines unaccounted for and the slopes shifting against them, the order was given: withdraw. The detachment pulled back in staggered formation, firing bursts into the tree line to cover their movement. Every step away from the valley felt like wading through something alive, the jungle closing in, pressing against their backs. Men shouted directions, their voices sharp with strain, but the night swallowed sound as quickly as it carried bullets. Tracers cut short-lived arcs into the darkness, striking nothing but foliage. The retreat was not a rout, but neither was it organized. It was survival, pure and urgent. And with every backward glance, each Marine expected to see the silhouettes again, tall, broad, waiting at the edge of firelight. By dawn, they had cleared the valley. The firing ceased, the stones no longer fell, and the forest stood still, as though nothing had happened. The ridge was quiet, the trails empty, no sign of the enemy they had fought through the night. The 2 missing Marines remained gone, their names carried forward as shadows within the unit. Officially, the report marked the encounter as hostile fire from concealed Viet Cong positions. Nothing more. But among the men, the memory refused to vanish. They had faced an ambush, yes, one by soldiers with rifles, the other by something that did not belong to war. In their silence, they all shared the same thought. They had left the valley behind, but the valley had not left them. Back at the forward base, the Marines pressed their commander for answers. They did not demand explanations alone. They demanded that the loss of 2 men be acknowledged for what had truly happened. They spoke of the stone barrage, of the towering figures glimpsed in the firelight, of the guttural cries that shook the valley. They swore it had been more than a Viet Cong ambush. The commander listened without expression, his face unreadable, his silence heavier than their words. When he finally spoke, his reply was clipped, final. Hostile fire. Nothing more. The protests came, sharp and desperate, but the pen in his hand moved with authority. The report that would leave the base was not the story they had lived. It was the version headquarters would accept. In the days that followed, the weight of that decision crushed the unit. Conversations gave way to silence, their anger tangled with grief. No one dared use the term Rock Apes aloud anymore, not out of disbelief, but because the name itself carried the weight of the 2 who were gone. The missing Marines became nothing more than lines on a casualty list, their absence explained away as the fog of war. Yet the men who had been there knew better. They remembered the stones, the eyes, the silence after the gunfire. They remembered fighting 2 enemies, one in uniform, one unseen. And the hardest wound to carry was not what they had faced in the valley, but the knowledge that no report would ever speak of it. Within days of the valley incident, the detachment received new orders. Officially, it was presented as a routine redeployment, a strategic adjustment in the region. But to the men, it felt like something else entirely. A quiet removal, a way of erasing the memory of what had taken place. No explanation was given for why their patrol sector was reassigned so abruptly. The maps were redrawn, the valley marked off limits, and another unit was told to avoid it altogether. The message was clear, even if unspoken. They would not return. The place where 2 Marines had vanished was to be left untouched, as though the war itself had agreed to forget. For the men, the transfer carried no relief. Instead, it deepened the unease. The valley haunted them, not just because of what they had seen, but because of how quickly it was sealed away. They carried their gear into a new sector, but the silence traveled with them, heavier than their packs. Around the campfires, no one dared mention the incident openly anymore. The names of the missing were spoken less and less, as though repetition itself might draw attention. The war rolled on, battles shifted, casualties mounted. But for those who had been there, the forced transfer left a wound deeper than combat. The knowledge that the jungle could consume men, and command could bury the memory. Back at the new sector, no formal order was needed. The silence grew on its own. Men who had once shouted over gunfire now struggled to speak of what they had seen. Some tried, beginning with a half-sentence over a cigarette or while cleaning their rifles, but the words faltered. To say it aloud was to risk disbelief, or worse, ridicule. Each man feared being the one singled out as unstable, the one accused of cracking under the weight of combat. So the stories stayed unspoken, swallowed by clenched jaws and restless nights. What had been a shared experience in the valley began to splinter until every man carried it alone. And yet, the memory did not vanish. It resurfaced in fragments, a sound recalled during patrol, a shadow glimpsed in dreams, the phantom weight of stones falling nearby. Some swore they remembered eyes, others the silhouettes, others only the absence of their missing brothers. The lack of agreement made the silence even heavier. Together, they had faced the ambush. But in the aftermath, no 2 men carried the same truth. The valley had divided them without firing another shot, and in that fracture, the silence was no longer just imposed. It became a wound each Marine carried in solitude, one that no report could erase and no comrade could share. Reunions brought little clarity. Men who had fought side by side disagreed about what they had seen, what they had heard, and what had taken their missing brothers. Some swore it was Rock Apes, creatures of the jungle unknown to science. Others insisted it had been the Viet Cong using tactics so strange they defied explanation. A few admitted they no longer knew what to believe. What bound them together was not certainty, but the absence of it. The valley had never released its grip. Even decades later, the war they carried was not against men in uniform, but against the silence of memory, a silence that refused to die. The story of the valley never found its place in official records, but it lingered in the margins of memory where war and folklore intertwine. For the Vietnamese villagers, the events were easily explained. They were the work of the Người Rừng, the forest people, spirits that punished trespassers and guarded the sacred hills. For the Marines, the name became Rock Apes, a label born from the stones that fell from the dark. Both names carried different weights, one sacred, one nervous. Yet both pointed to the same truth. Something had happened that refused to fit within the boundaries of war. In a conflict defined by statistics and body counts, this story slipped through, resisting the clarity that commanders demanded. Over time, the tale transformed. Some called it legend, others dismissed it as battlefield hysteria. A few insisted it was evidence of creatures unknown to science, hidden in the depths of Vietnam's mountains. What made it endure was not proof, but absence. No bodies, no photographs, no testimony that survived beyond whispers. And yet the echoes persisted. In veterans' sleepless nights, in villagers' warnings, in the unease that still clings to the Annamite range. Between myth and war, the story remains suspended, a shadow that neither folklore nor history can fully claim. It is a reminder that not all enemies wear uniforms, and not all battles leave a trace behind. The war in Vietnam was fought against men in uniform, but for those who entered the deep jungle, the struggle was never just against the Viet Cong. The jungle itself became an adversary, dense, suffocating, alive in ways no map could capture. It hid traps and ambushes, but also something else, something older. In the valley, the Marines had faced both the predictable violence of war and the unpredictable terror of the unknown. That duality remained with them. Rifles could answer enemy fire, but what could answer the silence, the stones, the eyes glimpsed in the dark? Some wounds were measured in shrapnel, others in questions that refused to die. Decades later, historians and soldiers still debate what happened. Was it a legend inflated by fear, a trick of guerrilla warfare, or the shadow of something science has not yet named? The answers matter less than the legacy. For the men who survived, the enemy was not only the Viet Cong, but also the unseen, the unexplainable presence that pressed against them in the jungle. It was an enemy that left no body to bury, no victory to claim, only silence. They fought men, yes, but in the Annamite hills, they also fought a war with the invisible, and that battle has never ended. The valley was erased from maps, but not from memory. 2 men vanished, and with them, the truth of what happened. Reports spoke of hostile fire, nothing more, yet veterans carried a silence heavier than their rifles. Some called them Rock Apes, others Người Rừng, spirits of the hills. Names do not matter. What lingers is the question.